The Point of It. A short story by Forster. 1. "I don't see the point of it," said Mickey, through much imbecile laughter. Harold went on rowing. They had spent too long on the sand dunes, and now the tide was running out of the estuary strongly. The sun was setting, the fields on the opposite bank shone bright, and the farmhouse where they were stopping glowed from its upper windows as though filled to the brim with fire. "We're going to be carried out to sea," Mickey continued. "You'll never win unless you bust yourself a bit, and you a poor invalid too. I back the sea." They were reaching the central channel, the backbone, as it were, of the retreating waters. Once past it, the force of the tide would slacken, and they would have easy going until they beached under the farm. It was a glorious evening. It had been a most glorious day. They had rowed out to the dunes at the slack, bathed, raced, eaten, slept, bathed, and raced, and eaten again. Mickey was in roaring spirits. God had never thwarted him hitherto, and he could not suppose that they would really be made late for supper by an ebbing tide. When they came to the channel, and the boat, which had been slowly edging upstream, hung motionless among the moving waters, he lost all semblance of sanity and shouted, "It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles, and see the great Achilles, whom we knew." Harold, who did not care for poetry, only shouted. His spirits also were roaring, and he neither looked nor felt a poor invalid. Science had talked to him seriously of late, shaking her head at his sunburnt body. What should Science know? She had sent him down to the sea to recruit, and Mickey to see that he did not tire himself. Mickey had been a nuisance at first, but common sense had prevailed, as it always does among the young. A fortnight ago he would not let the patient handle an oar. Now he bid him bust himself, and Harold took him at his word and did so. He made himself all will and muscle. He began not to know where he was. The thrill of the stretcher against his feet and of the tide up his arms merged with his friend's voice towards one nameless sensation. He was approaching the mystic state that is the athlete's true, though unacknowledged, goal. He was beginning to be. Mickey chanted, 1, 2, 1, 2, and tried to help by twitching the rudder. But Mickey had imagination. He looked at the flaming windows and fancied that the farm was a star and the boat its attendant satellite. Then the tide was the rushing ether stream of the universe, the interstellar surge that beats forever. How jolly! He did not formulate his joys after the weary fashion of older people. He was far too happy to be thankful. "Remember now, thy Creator in the days of thy youth," are the words of one who has left his youth behind, and all that Mickey sang was 1, 2. Harold laughed without hearing. Sweat poured off his forehead. He put on a spurt, as did the tide. "Wish the doctor could see you," cried Mickey. No answer. Setting his teeth, he went berserk. His ancestors called to him that it was better to die than to be beaten by the sea. He rowed with gasps and angry little cries, while the voice of the helmsman lashed him to fury. "That's right. 1, 2, plug it in harder. Oh, I say, this is a bit stiff, though. Let's give it up, old man, perhaps." The gulls were about them now. Some wheeled overhead, others bobbed past on the furrowed waters. The song of a lark came faintly from the land, and Mickey saw the doctor's trap driving along the road that led to the farm. He felt ashamed. "Look here, Harold, I oughtn't to have let you. I don't see the point of it." "Don't you?" said Harold with curious distinctness. "Well, you will some day," and so saying dropped both oars. The boat spun round at this. The farm, the trap, the song of the lark vanished, and he fell heavily against the rowlock. Mickey caught at him. He had strained his heart. Half in the boat and half out of it, he died. A rotten business. 2. A rotten business. It happened when Michael was 22 and he expected never to be happy again. The sound of his own voice shouting as he was carried out, the doctor's voice saying, "I consider you responsible." The coming of Harold's parents, the voice of the curate summarizing Harold's relations with the unseen. All these things affected him so deeply that he supposed they would affect him forever. They did not, because he lived to be over 70, and with the best will in the world, it is impossible to remember clearly for so long. The mind, however sensitive and affectionate, is coated with new experiences daily. It cannot clear itself of the steady accretion, and is forced either to forget the past or to distort it. So it was with Michael. In time, only the more dramatic incidents survived. He remembered Harold's final gesture, one hand grasping his own, the other plunged deep into the sea, because there was a certain aesthetic quality about it, not because it was the last of his friend. He remembered the final words for the same reason. "Don't you see the point of it? Well, you will someday." The phrase struck his fancy and passed into his own stock. After 30 or 40 years, he forgot its origin. He is not to blame. The business of life snowed him under. There is also this to say, he and Harold had nothing in common except youth. No spiritual bond could survive. They had never discussed theology or social reform, or any of the problems that were thronging Michael's brain, and consequently, though they had been intimate enough, there was nothing to remember. Harold melted the more one thought of him. Robbed of his body, he was so shadowy. Nor could one imagine him as a departed spirit, for the world beyond death is surely august. Neither in heaven nor hell is there place for athletics and aimless good temper, and if these were taken from Harold, what was left? Even if the unseen life should prove an archetype of this, even if it should contain a sun and stars of its own, the sunburn of earth must fade off our faces as we look at it, the muscles of earth must wither before we can go rowing on its infinite sea. Michael sadly resigned his friend to God's mercy. He himself could do nothing, for men can only immortalize those who leave behind them some strong impression of poetry or wisdom. For himself, he expected another fate. With all humility, he knew that he was not as Harold. It was no merit of his own, but he had been born of a more intellectual stock, and had inherited powers that rendered him worthier of life and of whatever may come after it. He cared for the universe, for the tiny tangle in it that we call civilization, for his fellow men who had made the tangle and who transcended it. Love, the love of humanity, warmed him, and even when he was thinking of other matters, was looking at Orion perhaps in the cold winter evenings, a pang of joy, too sweet for description, would thrill him, and he would feel sure that our highest impulses have some eternal value and will be completed hereafter. So full a nature could not brood over death. To summarize his career, soon after the tragedy, when he in his turn was recruiting, he met the woman who was to become his helpmate through life. He had met her once before and had not liked her. She had seemed uncharitable and hard. Now he saw that her hardness sprang from a morality that he himself lacked. If he believed in love, Janet believed in truth. She tested all men and all things. She had no patience with the sentimentalist who shelters from the world's rough and tumble. Engaged at that time to another man, she spoke more freely to Michael than she would otherwise have done, and told him that it is not enough to feel good and to feel that others are good. One's business is to make others better, and she urged him to adopt a profession. The beauty of honest work dawned upon the youth as she spoke. Mentally and physically, he came to full manhood, and after due preparation, he entered the Home Civil Service, the British Museum. Here began a career that was rather notable and wholly beneficial to humanity. With his ideals of conduct and culture, Michael was not content with the official routine. He desired to help others, and since he was gifted with tact, They consented to the operation. Before long, he became a conciliatory force in his department. He could mollify his superiors, encourage his inferiors, soothe foreign scholars, and show that there is something to be said for all sides. Janet, who watched his rise, taxed him again with instability. But now she was wrong. The young man was not a mere opportunist. He always had a sincere opinion of his own, or he could not have retained the respect of his colleagues. It was really the inherent sweetness of his nature at work, turned by a woman's influence towards fruitful ends. At the end of a 10 years' acquaintance, the two married. In the interval, Janet had suffered much pain, for the man to whom she had been engaged had proved unworthy of her. Her character was set when she came to Michael, and, as he knew, strongly contrasted with his own, and perhaps they had already interchanged all the good they could. But the marriage proved durable and sufficiently happy. He, in particular, made endless allowances, for toleration and sympathy were becoming the cardinal points of his nature. If his wife was unfair to the official mind, or if his brother-in-law, an atheist, denounced religion, he would say to himself, "They cannot help it. They are made thus, and have the qualities of their defects. Let me rather think of my own, and strive for a wider outlook ceaselessly." He grew sweeter every day. It was partly this desire for a wider outlook that turned him to literature. As he was crossing the 40s, it occurred to him to write a few essays, somewhat retrospective in tone and thoughtful rather than profound in content. They had some success. Their good taste, their lucid style, the tempered Christianity of their ethics whetted the half-educated public and made it think and feel. They were not and were not intended to be great literature, but they opened the doors to it and were indubitably a power for good. The first volume was followed by The Confessions of a Middle-Aged Man. In it, Michael paid melodious tribute to youth, but showed that ripeness is all. Experience, he taught, is the only humanizer. Sympathy, balance, and many-sidedness cannot come to a man until he is elderly. It is always pleasant to be told that the best is yet to be, and the sale of the book was large. Perhaps he would have become a popular author, but his wife's influence restrained him from writing anything that he did not sincerely feel. She had borne him 3 children by now, Henry, Catherine, and Adam. On the whole, they were a happy family. Henry never gave any trouble. Catherine took after her mother. Adam, who was wild and uncouth, caused his father some anxiety. He couldn't understand him in spite of careful observation, and they never became real friends. Still, it was but a little cloud in a large horizon. At home, as in his work, Michael was more successful than most men. Thus he slipped into the 50s. On the death of his father, he inherited a house in the Surrey Hills, and Janet, whose real interests were horticultural, settled down there. After all, she had not proved an intellectual woman. Her fierce manner had misled him, and perhaps herself into believing it. She was efficient enough in London society, but it bored her, for she lacked her husband's pliancy and aged more rapidly than he did. Nor did the country suit her. She grew querulous, disputing with other ladies about the names of flowers. And, of course, the years were not without their effect on him, too. By now, he was somewhat of a valetudinarian. He had given up all outdoor sports, and though his health remained good, grew bald, and rather stout and timid. He was against late hours, violent exercise, night walks, swimming when hot, muddling about in open boats, and he often had to check himself from fidgeting the children. Henry, a charming, sympathetic lad, would squeeze his hand and say, "All right, father." But Catherine and Adam sometimes frowned. He thought of the children more and more. Now that his wife was declining, they were the future, and he was determined to keep in touch with them, remembering how his own father had failed with him. He believed in gentleness, and often stood between them and their mother. When the boys grew up, he let them choose their own friends. When Catherine, at the age of 19, asked if she might go away and earn some money as a lady gardener, he let her go. In this case, he had his reward, for Catherine, having killed the flowers, returned. She was a restless, scowling young woman, a trial to her mother, who could not imagine what girls were coming to. Then she married and improved greatly. Indeed, she proved his chief support in the coming years. For soon after her marriage, a great trouble fell on him. Janet became bedridden and, after a protracted illness, passed into the unknown. Sir Michael, for he had been knighted, declared that he should not survive her. They were so accustomed to each other, so mutually necessary, that he fully expected to pass away after her. In this, he was mistaken. She died when he was 60, and he lived to be over 70. His character had passed beyond the clutch of circumstance, and he still retained his old interests and his unconquerable benignity. A second trouble followed hard on the first. It transpired that Adam was devoted to his mother and had only tolerated home life for her sake. After a brutal scene, he left. He wrote from the Argentine that he was sorry, but wanted to start for himself. "I don't see the point of it," quavered Sir Michael. "Have I ever stopped him or any of you from starting?" Henry and Catherine agreed with him, yet he felt that they understood their brother better than he did. "I have given him freedom all his life," he continued. "I have given him freedom. What more does he want?" Henry, after hesitation, said, "There are some people who feel that freedom cannot be given. At least I have heard so. Perhaps Adam is like that. Unless he took freedom, he might not feel free." Sir Michael disagreed. "I have now studied adolescence for many years," he replied, "and your conclusions, my dear boy, are ridiculous." The two rallied to their father gallantly, and after all, he spent a dignified old age. Having retired from the British Museum, he produced a little aftermath of literature. The great public had forgotten him, but the courtliness of his Musings of a Pensioner procured him some circulation among elderly and educated audiences, and he found a new spiritual consolation. Anima naturaliter Anglicana, he had never been hostile to the established church, and when he criticized her worldliness and occasional inhumanity, had spoken as one who was outside her rather than against her. After his wife's death and the flight of his son, he lost any lingering taste for speculation. The experience of years disposed him to accept the experience of centuries and to merge his feeble personal note in the great voice of tradition. Yes, a serene and dignified old age. Few grudged it to him. Of course, he had enemies who professed to see through him and said that Adam had seen through him too, but no impartial observer agreed. No ulterior motive had ever biased Sir Michael. The purity of his record was not due to luck, but to purity within, and his conciliatory manner sprang from a conciliated soul. He could look back on failures and mistakes, and he had not carried out the ideals of his youth. Who has? But he had succeeded better than most men in modifying those ideals to fit the world of facts, and if love had been modified into sympathy and sympathy into compromise, let one of his contemporaries cast the first stone. One fact remained, the fact of death. Hitherto, Sir Michael had never died, and at times he was bestially afraid. But more often, death appeared as a prolongation of his present career. He saw himself quietly and tactfully organizing some corner in infinity with his wife's assistance. Janet would be greatly improved. He saw himself passing from a sphere in which he had been efficient into a sphere which combined the familiar with the eternal and in which he would be equally efficient, passing into it with dignity and without pain. This life is a preparation for the next. Those who live longest are consequently the best prepared. Experience is the great teacher. Blessed are the experienced, for they need not further modify their ideals. The manner of his death was as follows. He, too, met with an accident. He was walking from his townhouse to Catherine's by a short cut through a slum. Some women were quarrelling about a fish, and as he passed, they appealed to him. Always courteous, the old man stopped, said that he had not sufficient data to judge on, and advised them to lay the fish aside for 24 hours. This chanced to annoy them, and they grew more angry with him than with one another. They accused him of doing them, of getting round them, and one, who was the worse for drink, said, "See if he gets round that," and slapped him with the fish in the face. He fell. When he came to himself, he was lying in bed with one of his headaches. He could hear Catherine's voice. She annoyed him. If he did not open his eyes, it was only because he did not choose. "He has been like this for nearly 2 years," said Henry's voice. It was, at the most, 10 minutes since he had fallen in the slum, but he did not choose to argue. "Yes, he's pretty well played out," said a third voice, actually the voice of Adam. How and when had Adam returned? "But then, he's been that for the last 30 years. "Gently, old boy," said Henry. "Well, he has," said Adam. "I don't believe in cant. He never did anything since Mother died, and damned little before. They've forgotten his books because they aren't first-hand. They're rearranging the cases he arranged in the British Museum. That's the lot. What else has he done, except tell people to dress warmly, but not too warm? Adam, you really mustn't. It's because nobody speaks up that men of the old man's type get famous. It's a sign of your sloppy civilization. You're all afraid. Afraid of originality, afraid of work, afraid of hurting one another's feelings. You let anyone come to the top who doesn't frighten you, and as soon as he dies, you forget him and knight some other figurehead instead." An unknown voice said, "Shocking, Mr. Adam, shocking. Such a dear old man, and quite celebrated, too." "You'll soon get used to me, nurse." The nurse laughed. "Adam, it is a relief to have you," said Catherine after a pause. "I want you and your boy to help me with mine." Her voice sounded dimmer. She had turned from her father without a word of farewell. "One must profit by the mistakes of others. After all, more heroism. I'm determined to keep in touch with my boy." "Larrup him," said Adam. "That's the secret." He followed his sister out of the room. Then Henry's delightful laugh sounded for the last time. "You make us all feel 20 years younger," he said, "more like when—" The door shut. Sir Michael grew cold with rage. This was life. This was what the younger generation had been thinking. Adam he ignored, but at the recollection of Henry and Catherine, he determined to die. If he chose, he could have risen from bed and driven the whole pack into the street. But he did not choose. He chose rather to leave this shoddy and ungrateful world. The immense and superhuman cynicism that is latent in all of us came at last to the top and transformed him. He saw the absurdity of love, and the vision so tickled him that he began to laugh. The nurse, who had called him a dear old man, bent over him, and at the same moment 2 boys came into the sick room. "How's Grandpapa?" asked one of them, Catherine's boy. "Not so well," the nurse answered. There was a silence. Then the other boy said, "Come along. Let's cut." "But they told us not to." "Why should we do what old people tell us? Dad's pretty well played out, and so's your mother." "Shocking. Be off with you both," said the nurse, and with a little croon of admiration, Catherine's boy followed his cousin out of the room. Their grandfather's mirth increased. He rolled about in the bed, and just as he was grasping the full irony of the situation, he died and pursued it into the unknown. 3. Mickey was still in bed. He was aware of so much through long, melancholy dreams, but when he opened his mouth to laugh, it filled with dust. Choosing to open his eyes, he found that he had swollen enormously and lay sunk in the sand of an illimitable plain. As he expected, he had no occasion greatly to modify his ideals. Infinity had merely taken the place of his bedroom and of London. Nothing moved on its surface except a few sand pillars, which would sometimes merge into each other as though confabulating and then fall with a slight hiss. Save for these, there was no motion, no noise, nor could he feel any wind. How long had he lain here? Perhaps for years, long before death perhaps, while his body seemed to be walking among men. Life is so short and trivial that who knows whether we arrive for it entirely, whether more than a fraction of the soul is aroused to put on flesh. The bud and the blossom perish in a moment. The husk endures, and may not the soul be a husk? It seemed to Mickey that he had lain in the dust forever, suffering and sneering, and that the essence of all things, the primal power that lies behind the stars, is senility, age, toothless, dropsical age, ungenerous to age and to youth, born before all ages and outlasting them, the universe as old age. The place degraded while it tortured. It was vast, yet ignoble. It sloped downward into darkness and upward into cloud, but into what darkness, what clouds? No tragic splendor glorified them. When he looked at them, he understood why he was so unhappy, for they were looking at him, sneering at him while he sneered. Their dirtiness was more ancient than the hues of day and night, their irony more profound. He was part of their jest, even as youth was part of his, and slowly he realized that he was, and had for some years been, in hell. All around him lay other figures, huge and fungus. It was as if the plain had festered. Some of them could sit up, others scarcely protruded from the sand, and he knew that they had made the same mistake in life as himself, though he did not know yet what the mistake had been. Probably some little slip, easily avoided had one but been told. Speech was permissible. Presently a voice said, "Is not ours a heavenly sky? Is it not beautiful?" "Most beautiful," answered Mickey, and found each word a stab of pain. Then he knew that one of the sins here punished was appreciation. He was suffering for all the praise that he had given to the bad and mediocre upon earth, when he had praised out of idleness, or to please people, or to encourage people, for all the praise that had not been winged with passion. He repeated, "Most beautiful," and the sky quivered, for he was entering into fuller torments now. One ray of happiness survived. His wife could not be in this place. She had not sinned with the people of the plain and could not suffer their distortion. Her view of life had proved right after all, and, in his utter misery, this comforted him. Janet should again be his religion, and as eternity dragged forward and returned upon itself and dragged forward, she would show him that old age, if rightly managed, can be beautiful. That experience, if rightly received, can lead the soul of man to bliss. Then he turned to his neighbor, who was continuing his hymn of praise. "I could lie here forever," he was saying. "When I think of my restlessness during life, that is to say, during what men miscall life, for it is death really, this is life. When I think of my restlessness on earth, I am overcome by so much goodness and mercy. I could lie here forever." "And will you?" asked Mickey. "Ah, that is the crowning blessing. I shall, and so will you." Here, a pillar of sand passed between them. It was long before they could speak or see. Then Mickey took up the song, chafed by the particles that were working into his soul. "I too regret my wasted hours," he said, "especially the hours of my youth. I regret all the time I spent in the sun. In later years I did repent, and that is why I am admitted here where there is no sun. Yes, and no wind, and none of the stars that drove me almost mad at night once. It would be appalling, would it not, to see Orion again, the central star of whose sword is not a star but a nebula, the golden seed of worlds to be. How I dreaded the autumn on earth when Orion rises, for he recalled adventure and my youth. It was appalling. How thankful I am to see him no more. Ah, but it was worse, cried the other, to look high leftward from Orion and see the twins. Castor and Pollux were brothers, one human, the other divine, and Castor died. But Pollux went down to hell that he might be with him. Yes, that is so. Pollux went into hell. Then the gods had pity on both and raised them aloft to be stars whom sailors worship and all who love and are young. Zeus was their father, Helen their sister, who brought the Greeks against Troy. I dreaded them more than Orion. They were silent, watching their own sky. It approved. They had been cultivated men on earth, and these are capable of the nicer torments hereafter. Their memories will strike exquisite images to enhance their pain. I will speak no more, said Mickey to himself. I will be silent through eternity. But the darkness prized open his lips, and immediately he was speaking. Tell me more about this abode of bliss, he asked. Are there grades in it? Are there ranks in our heaven? There are two heavens, the other replied, the heaven of the hard and of the soft. We here lie in the heaven of the soft. It is a sufficient arrangement, for all men grow either hard or soft as they grow old. As he spoke, the clouds lifted, and looking up the slope of the plain, Mickey saw that in the distance it was bounded by mountains of stone, and he knew, without being told, that among those mountains Janet lay, rigid, and that he should never see her. She had not been saved. The darkness would mock her too forever. With him lay the sentimentalists, the conciliators, the peacemakers, the humanists, and all who have trusted the warmer vision. With his wife were the reformers and ascetics and all sword-like souls. By different paths they had come to hell, and Mickey now saw what the bustle of life conceals, that the years are bound either to liquefy a man or to stiffen him, and that love and truth, who seem to contend for our souls like angels, hold each the seeds of our decay. It is indeed a sufficient arrangement, he said, both sufficient and simple. But answer one question more, that my bliss may be perfected. In which of these two heavens are the young? His neighbor answered, In neither. There are no young. He spoke no more, and settled himself more deeply in the dust. Mickey did the same. He had vague memories of men and women who had died before reaching maturity, of boys and unwedded maidens and youths lowered into the grave before their parents' eyes. Whither had they gone? That undeveloped minority? What was the point of their brief existence? Had they vanished utterly, or were they given another chance of accreting experiences until they became like Janet or himself? One thing was certain. There were no young, either in the mountains or the plain, and perhaps the very memory of such creatures was an illusion fostered by cloud. The time was now ripe for a review of his life on earth. He traced his decomposition, his work had been soft, his books soft, he had softened his relations with other men. He had seen good in everything, and this is itself a sign of decay. Whatever occurred, he had been appreciative, tolerant, pliant. Consequently, he had been a success. Adam was right. It was the moment in civilization for his type. He had mistaken self-criticism for self-discipline. He had muffled in himself and others the keen, heroic edge. Yet the luxury of repentance was denied him. The fault was his, but the fate humanity's, for everyone grows hard or soft as he grows old. This is my life, thought Mickey, my books forgotten, my work superseded. This is the whole of my life. And his agony increased, because all the same there had been in that life an elusive joy which, if only he could have distilled it, would have sweetened infinity. It was part of the jest that he should try, and should eternally oscillate between disgust and desire. For there is nothing ultimate in hell. Men will not lay aside all hope on entering it, or they would attain to the splendor of despair. To have made a poem about hell is to mistake its very essence. It is the imagination of men who will have beauty that fashions it as ice or flame. Old, but capable of growing older, Mickey lay in the sandy country, remembering that once he had remembered a country that had not been sand. He was aroused by the mutterings of the spirits round him. An uneasiness, such as he had not noted in them before, had arisen. "A pillar of sand," said one. Another said, "It is not. It comes from the river." He asked, "What river?" "The spirits of the damned dwell over it. We never speak of that river." "Is it a broad river?" "Swift and very broad." "Do the damned ever cross it?" "They are permitted, we know not why, to cross it now and again." And in these answers he caught a new tone, as if his companions were frightened and were finding means to express their fear. When he said, "With permission, they can do us no harm," he was answered, "They harm us with light and a song." And again, "They harm us because they remember and try to remind." Of what would they remind us? Of the hour when we were as they. As he questioned, a whisper arose from the low-lying verges. The spirits were crying to each other faintly. He heard, "It is coming. Drive it back over the river, shatter it, compel it to be old." And then the darkness was cloven, and a star of pain broke in his soul. He understood now. A torment greater than any was at hand. "I was before choice," came the song. "I was before hardness and softness were divided. I was in the days when truth was love, and I am." All the plain was convulsed, but the invader could not be shattered. When it pressed, the air parted, and the sand pillars fell, and its path was filled with senile weeping. "I have been all men, but all men have forgotten me. I transfigured the world for them until they preferred the world. They came to me as children, afraid. I taught them, and they despised me. Childhood is a dream about me, experience a slow forgetting. I govern the magic years between them, and am—" "Why trouble us?" moaned the shades. "We could bear our torment, just bear it, until there was light and a song. Go back again over the river. This is heaven, we were saying, that darkness is God. We could praise them till you came. The book of our deeds is closed. Why open it? We were damned from our birth. Leave it there. O supreme jester, leave us. We have sinned, we know it, and this place is death and hell." "Death comes," the voice pealed, "and death is not a dream or a forgetting. Death is real, but I too am real, and whom I will I save. I see the scheme of things, and in it no place for me, the brain and the body against me. Therefore I rend the scheme in two, and make a place, and under countless names have harrowed hell. Come." Then, in tones of inexpressible sweetness, "Come to me all who remember. Come out of your eternity into mine. It is easy, for I am still at your eyes, waiting to look out of them, still in your hearts, waiting to beat. The years that I dwelt with you seemed short, but they were magical, and they outrun time." The shades were silent. They could not remember. Who desires to remember? Desire is enough. There is no abiding home for strength and beauty among men. The flower fades, the seas dry up in the sun and all the stars fade as a flower. But the desire for such things, that is eternal, that can abide, and he who desires me is I. Then Mickey died a second death. This time he dissolved through terrible pain, scorched by the glare, pierced by the voice. But as he died, he said, "I do desire." And immediately the invader vanished, and he was standing alone on the sandy plain. It had been merely a dream, but he was standing. How was that? Why had he not thought to stand before? He had been unhappy in hell, and all that he had to do was to go elsewhere. He passed downwards, pained no longer by the mockery of its cloud. The pillars brushed against him and fell. The nether darkness went over his head. On he went, till he came to the banks of the infernal stream, and there he stumbled over a piece of wood, no vague substance, but a piece of wood that had once belonged to a tree. At his impact it moved, and water gurgled against it. He had embarked. Someone was rowing. He could see the blades of oars moving towards him through the foam, but the rower was invisible in cloud. As they neared mid-channel, the boat went more slowly, for the tide was ebbing, and Mickey knew that once carried out, he would be lost eternally. There was no second hope of salvation. He could not speak, but his heart beat time to the oars. 1, 2. Hell made her last effort, and all that is evil in creation, all the distortions of love and truth by which we are vexed, came surging down the estuary, and the boat hung motionless. Mickey heard the pant of breath through the roaring, the crack of angelic muscles. Then he heard a voice say, "The point of it!" And a weight fell off his body, and he crossed midstream. It was a glorious evening. The boat had sped without prelude into sunshine. The sky was cloudless, the earth gold, and gulls were riding up and down on the furrowed waters. On the bank they had left were some sand dunes rising to majestic hills. On the bank in front was a farm full to the brim with fire.
The Other Side of the Hedge, a short story by Forster. My pedometer told me that I was 25, and though it is a shocking thing to stop walking, I was so tired that I sat down on a milestone to rest. People outstripped me, jeering as they did so, but I was too apathetic to feel resentful. And even when Miss Eliza Dimbleby, the great educationist, swept past, exhorting me to persevere, I only smiled and raised my hat. At first, I thought I was going to be like my brother, whom I had had to leave by the roadside a year or two round the corner. He had wasted his breath on singing and his strength on helping others. But I had travelled more wisely, and now it was only the monotony of the highway that oppressed me. Dust underfoot and brown crackling hedges on either side, ever since I could remember. And I had already dropped several things. Indeed, the road behind was strewn with the things we all had dropped, and the white dust was settling down on them, so that already they looked no better than stones. My muscles were so weary that I could not even bear the weight of those things I still carried. I slid off the milestone into the road and lay there prostrate, with my face to the great parched hedge, praying that I might give up. A little puff of air revived me. It seemed to come from the hedge, and when I opened my eyes, there was a glint of light through the tangle of boughs and dead leaves. The hedge could not be as thick as usual. In my weak, morbid state, I longed to force my way in and see what was on the other side. No one was in sight, or I should not have dared to try, for we of the road do not admit in conversation that there is another side at all. I yielded to the temptation, saying to myself that I would come back in a minute. The thorns scratched my face, and I had to use my arms as a shield, depending on my feet alone to push me forward. Halfway through, I would have gone back, for in the passage all the things I was carrying were scraped off me, and my clothes were torn. But I was so wedged that return was impossible, and I had to wriggle blindly forward, expecting every moment that my strength would fail me, and that I should perish in the undergrowth. Suddenly, cold water closed round my head, and I seemed sinking down forever. I had fallen out of the hedge into a deep pool. I rose to the surface at last, crying for help, and I heard someone on the opposite bank laugh and say, "Another!" And then I was twitched out and laid panting on the dry ground. Even when the water was out of my eyes, I was still dazed, for I had never been in so large a space, nor seen such grass and sunshine. The blue sky was no longer a strip, and beneath it the earth had risen grandly into hills, clean, bare buttresses, with beech trees in their folds, and meadows and clear pools at their feet. But the hills were not high, and there was in the landscape a sense of human occupation, so that one might have called it a park or garden if the words did not imply a certain triviality and constraint. As soon as I got my breath, I turned to my rescuer and said, "Where does this place lead to?" "Nowhere, thank the Lord," said he and laughed. He was a man of 50 or 60, just the kind of age we mistrust on the road. But there was no anxiety in his manner, and his voice was that of a boy of 18. "But it must lead somewhere," I cried, too much surprised at his answer to thank him for saving my life. "He wants to know where it leads." He shouted to some men on the hillside, and they laughed back and waved their caps. I noticed then that the pool into which I had fallen was really a moat which bent around to the left and to the right, and that the hedge followed it continually. The hedge was green on this side, its roots showed through the clear water, and fish swam about in them, and it was wreathed over with dog roses and traveller's joy. But it was a barrier, and in a moment I lost all pleasure in the grass, the sky, the trees, the happy men and women, and realized that the place was but a prison, for all its beauty and extent. We moved away from the boundary, and then followed a path almost parallel to it, across the meadows. I found it difficult walking, for I was always trying to outdistance my companion, and there was no advantage in doing this if the place led nowhere. I had never kept step with anyone since I left my brother. I amused him by stopping suddenly and saying disconsolately, "This is perfectly terrible. One cannot advance, one cannot progress. Now we of the road—" "Yes, I know." I was going to say, "We advance continually." "I know. We are always learning, expanding, developing. Why, even in my short life I have seen a great deal of advance. The Transvaal War, the fiscal question, Christian Science, radium. Here, for example, I took out my pedometer, but it still marked 25, not a degree more. Oh, it stopped. I meant to show you. It should have registered all the time I was walking with you, but it makes me only 25. Many things don't work in here," he said. "One day a man brought in a Lee Metford, and that wouldn't work. The laws of science are universal in their application. It must be the water in the moat that has injured the machinery. In normal conditions, everything works. Science and the spirit of emulation. Those are the forces that have made us what we are." I had to break off and acknowledge the pleasant greetings of people whom we passed. Some of them were singing, some talking, some engaged in gardening, haymaking, or other rudimentary industries. They all seemed happy, and I might have been happy too if I could have forgotten that the place led nowhere. I was startled by a young man who came sprinting across our path, took a little fence in fine style, and went tearing over a ploughed field till he plunged into a lake, across which he began to swim. Here was true energy, and I exclaimed, "A cross-country race. Where are the others?" "There are no others," my companion replied, and later on, when we passed some long grass from which came the voice of a girl singing exquisitely to herself, he said again, "There are no others." I was bewildered at the waste in production and murmured to myself, "What does it all mean?" He said, "It means nothing but itself," and he repeated the words slowly as if I were a child. "I understand," I said quietly, "but I do not agree. Every achievement is worthless unless it is a link in the chain of development. And I must not trespass on your kindness any longer. I must get back somehow to the road and have my pedometer mended." "First you must see the gates," he replied, "for we have gates, though we never use them." I yielded politely, and before long we reached the moat again, at a point where it was spanned by a bridge. Over the bridge was a big gate, as white as ivory, which was fitted into a gap in the boundary hedge. The gate opened outwards, and I exclaimed in amazement, for from it ran a road, just such a road as I had left, dusty underfoot, with brown crackling hedges on either side as far as the eye could reach. "That's my road," I cried. He shut the gate and said, "But not your part of the road. It is through this gate that humanity went out countless ages ago, when it was first seized with the desire to walk." I denied this, observing that the part of the road I myself had left was not more than 2 miles off. But with the obstinacy of his years, he repeated, "It is the same road. This is the beginning, and though it seems to run straight away from us, it doubles so often that it is never far from our boundary and sometimes touches it." He stooped down by the moat and traced on its moist margin an absurd figure like a maze. As we walked back through the meadows, I tried to convince him of his mistake. "The road sometimes doubles, to be sure, but that is part of our discipline. Who can doubt that its general tendency is onward? To what goal we know not. It may be to some mountain where we shall touch the sky. It may be over precipices into the sea. But that it goes forward, who can doubt that? It is the thought of that that makes us strive to excel, each in his own way, and gives us an impetus which is lacking with you. Now that man who passed us, it's true that he ran well, and jumped well, and swam well, but we have men who can run better, and men who can jump better, and who can swim better. Specialization has produced results which would surprise you. Similarly, that girl—" Here I interrupted myself to exclaim, "Good gracious me! I could have sworn it was Miss Eliza Dimbleby over there, with her feet in the fountain." He believed that it was. "Impossible. I left her on the road, and she is due to lecture this evening at Tunbridge Wells. Why, her train leaves Cannon Street in— Of course, my watch has stopped like everything else. She is the last person to be here." People always are astonished at meeting each other. All kinds come through the hedge, and come at all times. When they are drawing ahead in the race, when they are lagging behind, when they are left for dead. I often stand near the boundary, listening to the sounds of the road. You know what they are, and wonder if anyone will turn aside. It is my great happiness to help someone out of the moat, as I helped you. For our country fills up slowly, though it was meant for all mankind. "Mankind have other aims," I said gently, for I thought him well-meaning, "and I must join them." I bade him good evening, for the sun was declining, and I wished to be on the road by nightfall. To my alarm, he caught hold of me, crying, "You are not to go yet." I tried to shake him off, for we had no interests in common, and his civility was becoming irksome to me. But for all my struggles, the tiresome old man would not let go, and as wrestling is not my speciality, I was obliged to follow him. It was true that I could have never found alone the place where I came in, and I hoped that, when I had seen the other sights about which he was worrying, he would take me back to it. But I was determined not to sleep in the country, for I mistrusted it, and the people too, for all their friendliness. Hungry though I was, I would not join them in their evening meals of milk and fruit, and, when they gave me flowers, I flung them away as soon as I could do so unobserved. Already they were lying down for the night like cattle, some out on the bare hillside, others in groups under the beeches. In the light of an orange sunset, I hurried on with my unwelcome guide, dead tired, faint for want of food, but murmuring indomitably, "Give me life, with its struggles and victories, with its failures and hatreds, with its deep moral meaning and its unknown goal." At last we came to a place where the encircling moat was spanned by another bridge, and where another gate interrupted the line of the boundary hedge. It was different from the first gate, for it was half transparent like horn and opened inwards. But through it, in the waning light, I saw again just such a road as I had left, monotonous, dusty, with brown crackling hedges on either side, as far as the eye could reach. I was strangely disquieted at the sight, which seemed to deprive me of all self-control. A man was passing us, returning for the night to the hills, with a scythe over his shoulder and a can of some liquid in his hand. I forgot the destiny of our race. I forgot the road that lay before my eyes, and I sprang at him, wrenched the can out of his hand, and began to drink. It was nothing stronger than beer, but in my exhausted state it overcame me in a moment. As in a dream, I saw the old man shut the gate and heard him say, "This is where your road ends, and through this gate, humanity, all that is left of it, will come in to us." Though my senses were sinking into oblivion, They seemed to expand ere they reached it. They perceived the magic song of nightingales and the odour of invisible hay and stars piercing the fading sky. The man whose beer I had stolen lowered me down gently to sleep off its effects, and as he did so, I saw that he was my brother.
Mr. Andrews, a short story by E.M. Forster. The souls of the dead were ascending towards the judgment seat and the gate of heaven. The world's soul pressed them on every side, just as the atmosphere presses upon rising bubbles, striving to vanquish them, to break their thin envelope of personality, to mingle their virtue with its own. But they resisted, remembering their glorious individual life on earth and hoping for an individual life to come. Among them ascended the soul of a Mr. Andrews, who, after a beneficent and honourable life, had recently deceased at his house in town. He knew himself to be kind, upright and religious, and though he approached his trial with all humility, he could not be doubtful of its result. God was not now a jealous God. He would not deny salvation merely because it was expected. A righteous soul may reasonably be conscious of its own righteousness, and Mr. Andrews was conscious of his. "The way is long," said a voice, "but by pleasant converse the way becomes shorter. Might I travel in your company?" "Willingly," said Mr. Andrews. He held out his hand, and the two souls floated upwards together. "I was slain fighting the infidel," said the other, exultantly, "and I go straight to those joys of which the prophet speaks." "Are you not a Christian?" asked Mr. Andrews gravely. "No, I am a believer, but you are a Moslem, surely." "I am not," said Mr. Andrews. "I am a believer." The two souls floated upwards in silence, but did not release each other's hands. "I am Broadchurch," he added gently. The word broad quavered strangely amid the interspaces. "Relate to me your career," said the Turk at last. "I was born of a decent middle-class family and had my education at Winchester and Oxford. I thought of becoming a missionary, but was offered a post in the Board of Trade, which I accepted. At 32, I married and had 4 children, 2 of whom have died. My wife survives me. If I had lived a little longer, I should have been knighted. Now I will relate my career. I was never sure of my father, and my mother does not signify. I grew up in the slums of Salonika. Then I joined a band, and we plundered the villages of the infidel. I prospered and had 3 wives, all of whom survive me. Had I lived a little longer, I should have had a band of my own. A son of mine was killed traveling in Macedonia. Perhaps you killed him." "It is very possible," The two souls floated upward, hand in hand. Mr. Andrews did not speak again, for he was filled with horror at the approaching tragedy. This man, so godless, so lawless, so cruel, so lustful, believed that he would be admitted into heaven. And into what a heaven, a place full of the crude pleasures of a ruffian's life on earth. But Mr. Andrews felt neither disgust nor moral indignation. He was only conscious of an immense pity, and his own virtues confronted him not at all. He longed to save the man whose hand he held more tightly, who he thought was now holding more tightly onto him. And when he reached the gate of heaven, instead of saying, "Can I enter?" as he had intended, he cried out, "Cannot he enter?" And at the same moment the Turk uttered the same cry, for the same spirit was working in each of them. From the gateway a voice replied, "Both can enter." They were filled with joy and pressed forward together. Then the voice said, "In what clothes will you enter?" "In my best clothes," shouted the Turk, "the ones I stole." And he clad himself in a splendid turban and a waistcoat embroidered with silver and baggy trousers and a great belt in which were stuck pipes and pistols and knives. "And in what clothes will you enter?" said the voice to Mr. Andrews. Mr. Andrews thought of his best clothes, but he had no wish to wear them again. At last he remembered and said, "Robes." "Of what colour and fashion?" asked the voice. Mr. Andrews had never thought about the matter much. He replied in hesitating tones, "White, I suppose, of some flowing, soft material," and he was immediately given a garment such as he had described. "Do I wear it rightly?" he asked. "Wear it as it pleases you," replied the voice. "What else do you desire?" "A harp," suggested Mr. Andrews. "A small one." A small gold harp was placed in his hand. "And a palm?" "No, I cannot have a palm, for it is the reward of martyrdom. My life has been tranquil and happy." "You can have a palm if you desire it." But Mr. Andrews refused the palm and hurried in his white robes after the Turk, who had already entered heaven. As he passed in at the open gate, a man, dressed like himself, passed out with gestures of despair. "Why is he not happy?" he asked. The voice did not reply. "And who are all those figures, seated inside on thrones and mountains? Why are some of them terrible and sad and ugly?" There was no answer. Mr. Andrews entered, and then he saw that those seated figures were all the gods who were then being worshipped on the earth. A group of souls stood round each, singing his praises. But the gods paid no heed, for they were listening to the prayers of living men, which alone brought them nourishment. Sometimes a faith would grow weak, and then the god of that faith also drooped and dwindled and fainted for his daily portion of incense. And sometimes, owing to a revivalist movement, or to a great commemoration, or to some other cause, a faith would grow strong, and the god of that faith grow strong also. And, more frequently still, a faith would alter, so that the features of its god altered and became contradictory, and passed from ecstasy to respectability, or from mildness and universal love to the ferocity of battle. And at times a god would divide into two gods, or three or more, each with his own ritual and precarious supply of prayer. Mr. Andrews saw Buddha and Vishnu and Allah and Jehovah and the Elohim. He saw little ugly determined gods who were worshipped by a few savages in the same way. He saw the vast, shadowy outlines of the neo-pagan Zeus. There were cruel gods and coarse gods and tortured gods, and worse still, there were gods who were peevish or deceitful or vulgar. No aspiration of humanity was unfulfilled. There was even an intermediate state for those who wished it, and for the Christian scientists a place where they could demonstrate that they had not died. He did not play his harp for long, but hunted vainly for one of his dead friends. And though souls were continually entering heaven, it still seemed curiously empty. Though he had all that he expected, he was conscious of no great happiness, no mystic contemplation of beauty, no mystic union with good. There was nothing to compare with that moment outside the gate, when he prayed that the Turk might enter and heard the Turk uttering the same prayer for him. And when at last he saw his companion, he hailed him with a cry of human joy. The Turk was seated in thought, and round him by sevens sat the virgins who are promised in the Koran. "Oh, my dear friend," he called out, "come here, and we will never be parted, and such as my pleasures are, they shall be yours also. Where are my other friends? Where are the men whom I love or whom I have killed?" "I, too, have only found you," said Mr. Andrews. He sat down by the Turk, and the virgins, who were all exactly alike, ogled them with coal-black eyes. "Though I have all that I expected," said the Turk, "I am conscious of no great happiness. There is nothing to compare with that moment outside the gate when I prayed that you might enter and heard you uttering the same prayer for me. These virgins are as beautiful and good as I had fashioned, yet I could wish that they were better." As he wished, the forms of the virgins became more rounded, and their eyes grew larger and blacker than before. And Mr. Andrews, by a wish similar in kind, increased the purity and softness of his garment and the glitter of his harp. For in that place their expectations were fulfilled, but not their hopes. "I am going," said Mr. Andrews at last. "We desire infinity, and we cannot imagine it. How can we expect it to be granted? I have never imagined anything infinitely good or beautiful excepting in my dreams." "I am going with you," said the other. Together they sought the entrance gate, and the Turk parted with his virgins and his best clothes, and Mr. Andrews cast away his robes and his harp. "Can we depart?" they asked. "You can both depart if you wish," said the voice, "but remember what lies outside." As soon as they passed the gate, they felt again the pressure of the world's soul. For a moment they stood hand in hand, resisting it. Then they suffered it to break in upon them, and they, and all the experience they had gained, and all the love and wisdom they had generated, passed into it and made it better.